Assassin's Creed as a series has been no stranger to utterly crazed pieces of downloadable content. From Assassin's Creed 2's mind-numbing and invasive Bonfire of the Vanities, which feels very much so like banging your head against a wall, to Odyssey's ill-conceived Fate of Atlantis, topping off an ill-conceived game, with many similar instances in between and beyond of pieces of DLC that either kind of just exist, fall short of being interesting, or are blatant cash grabs that exist for the sole purpose of making Ubisoft a little bit of extra cheddar. From my perspective, there have been more poor expansions within this franchise than solid ones, and yet there are a select few that are remembered by many fairly fondly. Take for instance the focus of today's video, the Jack the Ripper expansion for Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Here, arguably making the game's expansion interesting was hardly the problem. Visiting one of the darkest, most mysterious chapters of London's Victorian history is sure to bring with it some critical eyes for a multitude of reasons, but was also in a very dark way a golden opportunity to revise the upbeat and sometimes satirical tone of the base game, and truly tap into the underutilised oppressive atmosphere of Victorian London. However, did this expansion do that idea any justice whatsoever? That's what I intend to get to the bottom of in today's video. You see, obviously having recently replayed Syndicate, I felt a yearning for this, but darker. The base game's lightly whimsical nature doesn't do it for me. It may very well be your thing, dear viewer, and more power to you. However, if I wanted industrial whimsy, I'd look at Fable 3, not Assassin's Creed. And while Syndicate certainly wasn't a parody, I don't think it necessarily did justice to the struggles of living in an industrial London circa the mid to late 19th century. It's a game of positives and negatives, it's not entirely bad and it's not entirely great. I did an hour-long video on it, if you'd care to watch it, in which I revisit my mixed feelings about the overall experience, but perhaps my biggest gripe was with the game's overall tone. It had moments where it tapped into something darker and more engaging, and those were my favourite moments from the game. And so, basing a DLC around an infamous series of gruesome murders from 1888 naturally means there'd be no room for the experience to tastefully deliver levity. But does that, by default, make broaching such a subject tasteful? That of course depends on the execution, and Ubisoft has never been a stranger to utilising Assassin's Creed to touch upon sensitive topics, and thus I went into revisiting the Jack the Ripper expansion with an open mind. And sure enough, it delivered on the needed tone. London is a comedic playground no longer. Now it's darker, colder, more miserable, and we're introduced to a very different, older, more mature Jacob Fry as he hunts for the unknown miscreant known as the Ripper. Now this DLC begins on the night of the double event, which means the vast majority of the monster known as Jack the Ripper's Autumn of Terror is behind us, allowing our characters to understand the extent of the evil that's being dealt with. Now, it does have a bit of a loose interpretation as to what the double event actually was. Here it's pictured as one event and two victims, when in reality it was two separate events and two victims that occurred in different places on the same night. Here it also doesn't take long for the game to reveal the Ripper is leaving clues for Jacob in particular. It appears he's aware of the assassins, and Jacob is not surprised by this. It would appear Jacob therefore knows him. It would seem he's hunting an old ally. Except this old ally is actually hunting him. And it's in this first bout of gameplay that the DLC absolutely loses me. For we don't play as Jacob at all, but rather we play as the Ripper, which, when you think about it, is kind of perverse. I'm not one to argue that converting Jack the Ripper to entertainment full stop is bad. I disagree with such sentiment, and frankly, who am I to judge? It was so long ago now that nobody from that time has survived, and much of history is gruesome and sensitive depending on who you ask, and there's no world in which Ubisoft could touch down upon Victorian London and not visit these gruesome crimes. But there is still an element of tact required, and sometimes it is a bit too easy to forget these are things that actually happened. Jack the Ripper was a real serial murderer. His victims were real human beings who did not deserve to die, especially not in the way that they did. So embodying Jack the Ripper in an unhinged rogue assassin power fantasy to me just seems a bit wild, especially as the opening gameplay. Of course, we neither see nor take part in him carrying out his most brutal of acts, the ones that he's infamous for, but we do engage in our fair share of slaughter as the Ripper, especially in this opening sequence. I mean, for the most part, we can move past it and whatnot, and it's chiefly there to introduce us to this DLC's new half-baked mechanic, but even beyond that, this sequence serves to be subversive. If you thought you were going into this DLC to play as Jacob Fry for any length of time, well, this opening says we're not doing that, instead planting us in the twisted shoes of his disturbed adversary. And as with many aspects to this expansion, I can't tell if it's a stroke of genius commentary or tactless stupidity. And in that thought, it's worth remembering that we're only engaging with pixels on a screen, telling a fictional story loosely based around an unsavoury chapter in history, which wasn't circa this DLC's release a new thing for this franchise to go entertaining. But I really can't tell if such thought provocation was intentional or unintended. But you know what? Ubisoft must have seen the criticisms for Syndicate and said, "You want dark? Well, here's dark." And it most certainly is, as the opening has us inhabit a lunatic, and also establishes the key framework for the Assassin's Creed spin on the mystery. This is not a story of uncovering the identity of Jack the Ripper in the Assassin's Creed universe. The game couldn't care less about who went by that moniker. And frankly, I can respect that. If it was framing that mystery in any capacity, we wouldn't be playing as Jack for any length of time. Rather, this nameless, faceless baghead, this cruelest of murderers, exercises a thought experiment that I'm sure any long-standing Assassin's Creed fan has attempted to picture at least once. In the Assassin's Creed universe, we know what the assassins are all about. Furthermore, we know what they're capable of, the impossible feats they can accomplish. They're a brotherhood of rigorously trained philosopher killers, harbouring complex ideologies, open to an incredibly wide range of interpretations. We've seen a vast variety of situational application to the assassin's ideology. We've seen assassins go bad from our perspective, we've seen them betray the tenets of the Creed. We've seen members of the Brotherhood defect to the ancient enemy, the Templars. And we've seen assassins swayed by unfathomable objects left behind by an ancient civilization with a technological capacity extending far beyond what anyone could possibly comprehend. And through it all, the one thing we truly hadn't seen was the Creed unleashed, interpreted through the musings of a madman and weaponized into raw, untempered ferocity. And it's the horror that such a notion proposes that this expansion bids to address.
No, 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 no!
Jack, we can fix you.
Fix me? I am the solution.
The idea conveyed through this opening is incredibly strong, and while I absolutely abhor the idea of playing as the Ripper, it conveys everything I wanted from the base game of Syndicate within the time span of about 8 minutes. And then we get a time jump to about a month later when Eevee Fry returns from India, having been summoned by Jacob, who is now, per the intro, missing. And it's odd that this expansion's main protagonist would be Eevee, considering Jacob's the one with an emotional connection to whoever this guy is, but nonetheless it provides Eevee with a means to jump straight into investigating this for herself without the need for too much exposition. At this point, all we can do is question whether Jacob is even alive or dead, as the intro makes it seem like the Ripper ended his life. But the fact that no body has been found, as disclosed by Detective Frederick Aberline, who's portrayed less like an incompetent idiot here than he was in the base game of Syndicate, another win for the DLC, suggests doubt either way. And having sat on this for years now, I think I actually quite like this direction and concept. Seeing Jacob be presumably defeated by Jack gives us the stakes to not fly head on into a frantic pursuit, as we know our adversary to be ferocious, even by an assassin's standards, and thus we'll need to investigate more carefully. We're hunting one who can just as easily be hunting us, and that if anything elevates the tense tone this DLC is aiming for. Here we see the district of Whitechapel on its arse. The temperate climate of the base game is no more. Instead, the atmosphere is cold. We can see the characters breathing, and sleet falls slowly from the sky, not really settling as snow on the ground. The weather matches the atmosphere the game is striving for, as does the colour grading. Gone is the base game's painterly aesthetic, and in its stead we have bitter cold, miserable days, where the sky ranges from perpetually overcast to downright polluted, and hazy nights where any light source seems to travel 10 times farther. This grungier environment is one in which I can envision the people of London struggling and fighting to survive more. The rot and misery of this particular part of the city is on full display. You can feel the destitution, that aura of being in a place hostile to happiness, The Jack the Ripper expansion features a well-crafted atmosphere of strife. We are at a rock bottom, incarnated in a physical location, and our task is to investigate an infamous serial killer whose activities, if anything, shone a spotlight on the deprivation of London's East End. And I commend this world building for how it encourages you to lock in. As we head to the site of the murder of Mary Ann Polly Nichols, the first of the 5 canonical Ripper victims, whom Abeline suggests is not actually the body that was found here, which of course I have opinions about. Nonetheless, the tone is established and it isn't just appropriate, it's good. If Ubisoft accomplished nothing else here, at least they did that. And even though the vast majority of the Autumn of Terror is behind us, it was another good move to have us begin our investigations at the site of the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, the first of what's referred to as the canonical 5. It indicates to us clearly there's some meat between where we are now and the final showdown with the killer. We investigate the scene, discovering an assassin's ring, suggesting the woman who was murdered here was not in fact Mary Ann Nichols, but another woman entirely. An assassin. And this is 100% something I take issue with. Remember that statement I made earlier about Jack the Ripper being a real serial killer and his victims being real human beings? Considering the very memory of their identities has been reduced to a statistic in this maniac's twisted prowl, why is this DLC suggesting it can take those deaths away from those names? I get that it's to slot in the assassin plot, but rather than having the identity of the deceased being assumed to be that of a particular individual but actually being an assassin, why not just make that individual the assassin? It's very rare that I pull Assassin's Creed up on historical accuracy. By and large, it's not that important to the series, outside facilitating a vague backdrop. As much as it's nicer, the more accurate it is. But here, we're adding an unnecessary step in the plot that nobody's going to remember 5 minutes later that only serves to further insult the memory of somebody who actually existed by, even in this fictitious setting, denying that their death belonged to them. And the reason why the name of this poor woman is known to this very day is because of that moment. You might as well deny she existed altogether, which is what the game basically does when she never actually shows up, which might lend that flippant dilution some gravity. The DLC never actually explicitly states this isn't Nichols, just heavily implies it, with Abeline suggesting that it's not Nichols and the game still referring to this victim as Nichols. And I really don't understand what the point is in installing ambiguity here when there are other parts in this plot that need it but sorely lack it. I get the assassin part of a plot needs to find a way in somehow, but when trying to integrate sensitive history, it's a good idea to not devolve into nonsense at the first opportunity. Oh, speaking of...
I'll need to tackle Jack's influence over the gangs in London.
I'm sorry, fucking what? Eevee Fry has just plucked knowledge from the ether that somehow Jack the Ripper has influence over the gangs in London, even though up until this point, outside of menu cues, there is really no mention of this. Even the base game made at least a half-assed attempt at trying to integrate the gang bollocks in a way that narratively made sense. Here we're just slapped with Eevee having a moment of clairvoyance. And sure enough, as the menus tell us, Jim Bob Slash Gremlin has taken over the Rooks. The Rooks have been radicalized into Jack the Ripper's murder gang, and thus this game's side content is basically just undoing everything we've been doing in the base game. Take for instance the fight clubs we participated in 1868. Well, here in 1888 we're tasked with shutting them down, and we shut them down by participating in them again. Also, when did the Rooks decide green jackets were shit, let's shift to purple? Like, I understand the reasoning, I quite like purple as a colour, a lot better than I like the colour green. I think if grass was purple instead of green, a lot of the world's problems would be solved. But why? Is it just to make us not think we're fighting our former allies when we absolutely are? Is it to make us feel better when we headbutt the same bold big man into the next life for what could possibly be the 600th time? The DLC loads us with information to unpack and then never unpacks any of it. The bio simply states he staged a coup within the Rooks, making him out to be some anonymous crime lord rather than a cowardly and depraved maniac. I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't really understand. But hey, ultimately the side content's primary purpose is to be secondary nonsense to pad the game out, and nonsense it most certainly is in Assassin's Creed Syndicate Jack the Ripper. Because a database entry explaining that Jack somehow radicalized the entire Rooks against Jacob and therefore against Eevee is not a sufficient explanation for how that actually occurred. It's a negative development that takes place entirely off-screen, and Eevee rather abruptly and out of nowhere brings up the notion that we've now got to contend with the fallout of events we weren't privy to. If this follow-up plot really needed to turn the gang scenario in London on its head, they should have made that a part of the actual plot rather than just have it happening in between one story and the follow-up. Undoing everything we saw occur in the story that came before isn't something you should be telling us, it should be something you'd be showing us. This is one of the major reasons why I'm not too huge on The Force Awakens in hindsight. In Return of the Jedi, the Empire is finally defeated, starting a new trilogy, the sequel trilogy. Obviously, Disney thought Star Wars was entirely out of ideas and came up with the Empire 2, and we're left none the wiser as to how exactly that happened. We just have to accept that it has, albeit with shiny new helmets and more overt Nazi references. And a similar thing happens here, the Rooks just become the Blighters too, albeit instead of having red coats, they have purple ones, which weren't even the same coloured coats that they were when they were our allies. And since the gang in the base game was comprised of absolutely no characters, just the same generic NPCs who happen to, aside from colour coding, be identical to our enemies, there's absolutely no emotional weight to that betrayal, nor is there any emotional weight to slaughtering them. And for all of that sloppiness, I still don't understand why Jack the Ripper needs a fucking gang. It's unnecessary, it's inefficient, and all it stands to serve is the base game's gimmick. And beyond that, the best it does is give us enemies to stab who aren't police officers. But Whitechapel at the time was rife with crime. You don't need them to be tied to Jack through inexplicable means. All you need is a bit of exposition from Aberline that the gangs are getting unruly, and in order for the police to achieve maximum mobility, they need to be dealt with. That's justification enough for side content. As for the Rooks, simply have them be disbanded. Syndicate's plot made it clear that Jacob pivoted towards being a master assassin more than a crime boss, and this would have been fine as the Rooks only really existed for gameplay purposes in the base game anyway. Like I said, they had no characters within their ranks, aside from maybe Agnes McBean. I wonder what she's up to. I guess it exists in service to the Jacob-Jack subplot that isn't adequately explored either. But I don't think fashioning a twisted, psychopathic, disorganised serial murderer into a highly organised, dark lord of the criminal underworld is the approach I'd have opted for. Nonetheless, we're left with no choice but to accept it. The main plot continues with Eevee making tracks to Jacob's lodgings to investigate his disappearance. It becomes apparent avoiding the streets wherever possible is the best approach, as the nefarious purple Rooks are everywhere and they're overtly antagonistic. And this is a part of the storytelling where, in hindsight, I'm unsure if it was a stroke of genius or just a regular old stroke really. As we enter the apartment, it becomes apparent that something occurred here. I mean, we know that, we saw it happen at the beginning of the expansion, but this is Eevee realising that Jack and Jacob certainly came to blows here, or at least it would seem so. We learn that Jacob and Eevee were trained in India to use fear tactics, whatever that means. There is a gameplay meaning for this, of course, we'll get to that in a moment, but aside from that, there are just signs of a struggle, broken pots, blood, and a picture on a wall that blows the identity of Jack the Ripper wide open in the Assassin's Creed context anyway.
The last time Henry, my brother, and I were together was in India. 15 years ago. When the photograph was taken, we stood facing a temple of Kali, and that's one of the boys Jacob brought to train with the Brotherhood. What did we call him? Jack the Lad. Reckless and roguish, much like my brother.
And this is the point that if the Jack the Ripper mystery was ever integral to this plot, it just shat itself. But I don't think it actually is. Jack the Ripper is just an assassin, or a former assassin named Jack. We know this is a clue because it was held to the wall with a fear spike, and as the intro suggests, Jacob knows the Ripper and refers to him as Jack, meaning Jack the Ripper in this DLC is just called Jack. And so, what this is telling us is there's no interesting revelation at the back end of Jack the Ripper. And that, I'm sure, can be disappointing if that's what you've come expecting, and it doesn't feel like a moment of writing genius, it has to be said, but you could take this as a commentary on the fact that Jack the Ripper, the real Jack the Ripper, does not deserve his name to be remembered. In that respect, I can respect the DLC for not treating it as that particular mystery, or at least not framing it from that angle. But if that is the intended message, what are you going to substitute that mystery with? This, of course, is an area where Assassin's Creed truly never lacks for a wealth of ideas. This is now a mystery of why, no longer who. We've already framed the Ripper as a former assassin, and thus we can only assume as an assassin he's been exposed to the philosophical intricacies of the Brotherhood. With that in mind, it becomes a question of what's motivating him to carry out this vicious betrayal. And that question sets in just in time for a really cool cutscene where it's revealed that while Eevee's investigating this room, Jack is across the road atop a rooftop watching. And eerily, Eevee seems to take note of this and turns and looks. However, by this point the Ripper is gone. I like the psychological aspect on display here. Yes, Eevee Fry as a trained assassin likely has a greater bearing of her peripheral vision than the average individual. But that's not what's happening here. She's not noticing because she's trained to notice. This appears to be an instinct reaction. You know when you know somebody's looking at you but you can't see them, so you turn to look where they are. And sure enough, they may still be looking, they may not be. Nonetheless, we as people at times appear to have this ability to detect when eyes are staring right at us. And while this is not a reliable phenomenon, I think plenty can relate to such a familiar feeling. And it's a great feeling to put onto the audience. Jack is watching. Jack knows we're hunting him. And he may very well be hunting us too. Biding his time. Only ready to reveal himself when he's ready. So in his first appearance since the intro, he's only eerily observing, for but a few moments before vanishing again. And I also love the differences in lighting and the density of the fog between the shot where Jack is standing there and the shot where he's gone. It shows that his very presence darkens the area around him. Not in a literal superpower sense, it would be a pretty shoddy power, but as symbolism. His presence is gloomy, oppressive, and sinister, and I'm not too proud to appreciate what is a good shot. So why immediately then go and break this building tension by having Eevee Fry encounter some of the purple rooks waiting for her outside? Well, of course it's to introduce this game's new flavour of gameplay, the fear mechanics. This system basically re-implements the old Assassin's Creed concept of your enemy's nerves getting the best of them. So, if you throw a fear bomb, they might get nervous. But if you then go and impale a bloke on a spike and then give him some dust, they might run off. I do not understand what this adds value-wise. I get that it can be convenient to make your life easier to not have to fight absolutely everybody and always have these means through which you can utilise fear to bring a fight to an end. And I also understand its brutal context for Jack's gameplay. The fear system is there as a means to cheaply make Jack the Ripper seem intimidating, and it works. The value this has for Eevee Fry is a little bit harder to discern. The only difference, of course, being that Eevee's use of the fear system is entirely non-lethal, which I think is a bit odd for an assassin, but here we are. And it's one thing for a massive, powerful, faceless entity that skulks in the shadows to perform acts that have a laxative effect on the composure of the people around them. And Eevee Fry, who isn't attempting to make herself a shadowy entity, though it would be nice, she's an assassin after all, accomplishing the same thing without the consequences of having murdered someone, especially when facing over 30 thugs in open combat. As is the case when shutting down the fight clubs, nobody seems to at any point become a little bit rattled or even hesitant to fight her because they will clearly lose. Unless of course you use these esoteric tools. And I don't know what this ridiculous smoke is that Eevee uses. I'd assume it has some capacity of hallucinogenic effect that alters their perception to make Eevee seem much more intimidating, but surely you don't need a magical tool that just reliably does that. For Jack, the system works because that's not what he's doing. Rather, he's deliberately performing acts that have inherent shock value. What he does is naturally unnerving because it's savage and animalistic. For Eevee, it's a magical, ill-explained shit-yourself gas to implement a system that could have, and should have, been added more seamlessly. Take for instance the Batman Arkham series. Fear is utilised in these games more than anything in the use of stealth. Should you use calculated movements to pick off your foes one by one, that naturally increases their anxiety. They get increasingly disorganised as their numbers thin. And we can monitor this mood with the heartbeat monitor that Batman for some reason has for everything ever. It's far from an elaborate system, but both in how it functions and how it's expanded, you get a sense of your opponents being afraid of you. It's not a grand system you can simply tap into with the press of a button. It simply occurs naturally as you play the game the way it's meant to be played. It's a system you passively maneuver to favour you. and is rewarding despite perhaps its own flaws, because above all else it makes sense. As numbers thin and confusion rises, more mistakes are made. Unfortunately, that's not what this DLC does, and there's an argument to be made for it being an entirely different system and therefore incomparable, and I can see that. But it doesn't have huge gameplay advantage aside from circumnavigating some fairly otherwise easy bits of gameplay. And rather than having fear be the byproduct of anything that might actually instill it, we have the equivalent to press triangle to make people scared. Sure, it can compound, we have the fear bombs and we have the brutal takedowns that aren't lethal, but the setup isn't built off the back of anything and the results are negligible too. Those you frighten will run away, find a bold guy, and calm down. And while I'm sure having a nicely polished, crisp dome does have a soothing effect on people, the fear system foils itself more readily than it actually provides any advantages. That being said, I have respect for it being there. Yes, assassins would naturally utilise some extent of fear to accomplish their objectives, but frankly it is a glittery version of a system that even Assassin's Creed 1 had, and many of the subsequent titles did too, where in combat if you find yourself slaughtering waves of enemies, eventually the weaker enemies will decide, you know what, I'm running away. And when you scrape away the presentation of Syndicate's DLC here, the system doesn't function in a new and inventive way. It's a more colourful version of that very same system, perhaps with an added layer of stealth use case that's incredibly limited. Could it have been more? Absolutely. Is it? No. While we're on the topic of talking gameplay things, there's only really one other aspect that I'd like to discuss, and that is the fact that Eevee Fry is non-lethal. Yes, you can still kill, but assassinations and combat takedowns are non-lethal, simply knocking the purple rooks out rather than ending their lives, unless of course you utilise a tool that can't be made non-lethal without changing how the game plays, such as the gun for instance, or throwing knives. Now, I understand the intent behind making Eevee's main actions not necessarily lethal, and that is because we're hunting Jack the Ripper, a serial killer, and we need to find a means to make ourselves distinct from Jack. But if simply not killing is the only distinction, then I'm sorry, we're assassins, we're not that fucking distinct. And of course, there are many bits of gameplay in which Eevee is lethal, and there's nothing stopping you from running around and stabbing everyone you've just knocked out with the hidden blade while they're on the floor, which is arguably a lot more cold-blooded than simply killing them in open conflict. And that's a really strange thing. If something costs too much effort to make appear non-lethal, it's still just lethal. So while Eevee Fry in theory doesn't kill as many as in a typical Assassin's Creed story, she still kills. And the only reason I could think for why this would possibly be is, like I said, for us to stand apart from the crazed lunatic. That really shouldn't be the layer upon which the difference is set, if I'm being entirely honest, because having Jack the Ripper be a member of the Assassin Brotherhood, we're not just comparing him to Eevee Fry, we're comparing him to virtually every Assassin's Creed protagonist whose games were not framed around this question. Fortunately, this difference between Eevee and Jack is not narratively addressed, otherwise it would certainly open itself up to some more confusion. But I really don't understand why Ubisoft went through minimal effort to attempt to convey that Eevee Fry is non-lethal sometimes, without making any radical changes for that to matter. I mean, if you're not going to revolutionise the gameplay to facilitate this, I'd certainly have liked to see some explanation as to why Eevee Fry prefers non-lethal means now, at least when it comes to dealing with the general rabble. But that really isn't explored either. So Eevee being non-lethal makes no changes and only serves to ensure we cannot use kukri blades or indeed cane swords like the base game and are instead locked into using knuckle dusters, which brings me onto the customization, I suppose, which for a DLC is fine. It's just a small selection of weapons and a selection of dyes for Eevee's attire, and that's kind of it. That's fine. I can't say I understand the point of leveling carrying over into this expansion though, because we begin at level 10 and we've got to invest 30 skill points in 7 new abilities, which brings us to level 11. And these abilities are all based on the Fear system, so they don't bring Syndicate's gameplay loop to a new height, and there's no way of telling what skills we have from the base game and what skills have not carried over. As a rule of thumb though, if something was too convenient in the base game, you probably don't have it anymore. Take for instance the skill you can unlock that prevents those you kidnap from struggling at certain phases, forcing you to stay engaged and reassert control, because that would have been too useful. Now, enough mumbling about those bits and bats, because we're coming up on something else I'd like to talk about. The thankful fact that Blackbox missions do carry over from Assassin's Creed Syndicate into its expansion. It features 2 new Blackbox missions, which is a respectable amount for a short DLC, although they find themselves being explained by Jack the Ripper is in cahoots with some dangerous powerful people, which is simply not the justification needed for doing these missions, as I can see assassins taking on exploitative individuals regardless of whether or not they're tied to the conspiracy they're currently chasing. And the woes of the East End of London at this time is a complex subject that doesn't necessarily need to be watered down to being the mastermind plan of the Ripper. Should you give him too many connections, as this DLC certainly does, he becomes less mysterious. And while I can respect this DLC isn't necessarily going for tackling the mystery of Jack the Ripper as such, when every peripheral event, every single occurrence and all the misery is tied back to him, rather directly, one might add, rather than that simply being a symbol of this misery, you end up simplifying topics that could have been interesting, and that is in my opinion the result here. Nonetheless, it is easy justification for some entertaining gameplay, and our first assassination is that of Lady Olwyn Owers, who runs several brothels in the city and appears to be something of a lieutenant of the Ripper. Using her network of prostitutes and tendency to entrap clients, prizing sensitive information and other blackmail schemes to feed intelligence to Jack, keeping him up to date with developments within the City of London. Naturally for this, and the fact that her relation with the Ripper keeps those working for her afraid, she has to die. So we head to her estate, Owers Manor, where unlike the miserable sleet of the city, the snow has actually settled. And with a bit of creativity and the standard assassin skills, we've got to infiltrate the mansion and kill her. Now, it must be said I've always been a great enjoyer of black box missions, and this might be one of the better ones. While I wouldn't call black box missions deep in general, they are typically quite fun. Because the premise is we don't necessarily get directed towards how to approach our target, we simply have to seek out and discover opportunities and then commit to a pathway that works best. Sure, we can absolutely run in and cause a massive scene and then in the middle of the bloodbath somewhere kill the target, but where's the fun in that? That just makes it bland gameplay. The fun comes from efficiently moving through this open area, taking into consideration the information you're provided with, and uncovering that coveted unique kill opportunity. And while this black box mission is one of the better ones in the series, or at least in the parts of the series that do these missions, it must be said it still highlights the flaws. The flaws being, the game basically tells you where all the opportunities vaguely are and what they vaguely might be, meaning we don't necessarily need to analyze the environment on the move to uncover any opportunities because we know where to find them and we know roughly what they do. They make sense in context, mostly, but they're not naturally integrated. They are just objectives for us to follow from the moment we begin, albeit largely optional ones. But unlike your standard Assassin's Creed optional objectives, such as this one from later on in the expansion, where the general premise is do things the hard way and you might get a bit more money and a bit more XP, on the premise that that's the objectively correct way to play the mission, even if playing any mission that way makes it infinitely more boring. And before you ask, I don't know how I've managed to happen upon Schrodinger's optional objective here. These optional opportunities in black box missions are actually optional objectives you might want to do, beyond a sense of completionism and a truckload of self-loathing. I did notice the Lady Oa's assassination mission was rendered quite easy by the use of the rope launcher, as you can cross the grounds without touching them once, so you really don't have to worry about being detected there at all. So in a way it does expose that the rope launcher is a bit of a bypass, but what makes this black box mission a good addition to this particular expansion is not necessarily how it plays, but rather the difference you see here versus what you see on the streets of Whitechapel. While Whitechapel is suffering, here we see an affluent, opulent party, showing that despite the plight of society's lower classes, for the wealthy, life continues. And the presence of prostitutes is utilised here to symbolise that for those you'd see here, often society's underclass is observed as but a sum of assets to be exploited. As for talk of a crazed murderer in London's East End, to those who aren't necessarily immediately threatened by that, it becomes more a point of intrigue than a subject of waking horror, a horror people are currently living, until they're suddenly not, of course. It may not be cooked medium rare, but there is a blend on display here. We're skulking around a rather warm party against the bitter cold, wintry backdrop of a dark, miserable time of year, amidst unsavoury events. And even if it does somehow directly tie back to the Ripper, we're engaging with the setting and its struggles first and foremost. This isn't something I feel the rest of the expansion does especially well, and while one mission showcasing it isn't Absolution, it's great that Assassin's Creed Syndicate paid some mind to narratively integrate a character who fundamentally, above all else, is taking advantage of horrific events, allowing them power. It, like most Blackbox missions, is not particularly deep. There isn't a variety of options, it just boils down to the right way and the reckless way. But it is an atmosphere-enhancing moment, and it does stand out against the vast majority of the rest of the expansion that justifies you slowing down just enough to soak in what's there. And of course it keeps the plot moving and spreads it out a bit, giving us a main target who isn't the Ripper. And while it does contribute to diluting what the Ripper actually was to make way for a typical Assassin's Creed conspiracy of some variety, as far as moments go, it's alright. And reasonably, Assassin's Creed will never touch down on any subject without giving us people to kill. But this mission's best moment actually occurs upon the escape. As something of a follow-up to this scene where Jack is clearly watching, upon our departure from the estate via a carriage, the camera pans back up to the mansion's rooftop. Where at first it would appear there's nothing to see. We get the mission complete card, but it's upon clearing that we catch another glimpse of the Ripper. Again, it appears he's watching, monitoring us. It's an eerie thought, and I can't help but think the intended feeling is the suggestion that he's always watching and he's never far away. No matter where we are or what we're engaging with, Jack is, to some extent, aware. It's food for thought while mooching through the streets of Whitechapel, and that idea does add to the atmosphere. It helps put us in the mindset of somebody who lived at this time in this place. The thought of this phantom moving among us, never too far away. It becomes a terrifying inverse of the Assassin's Creed notion of hiding in plain sight, because that is exactly what Jack must be doing too. Jack has corrupted the Assassin's teachings, and it feels as if throughout this story, he's using them against us. Anyway, the DLC's second Blackbox mission follows soon after. We learned from Lady Oas and the Tin of Worms that opened, that Jack and his band of merry men have been keeping prisoners aboard Old Hulk prison ships moored at Deptford, and naturally Eevee heads there in hopes she might find Jacob, and in failing that, some sign of him. I'm not sure I like the idea of Jack the Ripper having access to these resources necessarily. It doesn't make any sense, but we're well past establishing the Assassin's Creed version of Jack the Ripper is so removed from Jack the Ripper that it might as well just be Jack the guy who stabs people occasionally, runs a gang of angry people and keeps prisoners in a big boat. But of course it's too soon. Jacob isn't here, but Jack is keeping some rather nondescript Templars in some cages for some reason. That's never explained. I presume it's just a reuse of a model, but if that's the case, please at least get rid of the Templar strap. But I suppose it's funny more than bad. And they tell us that Jack performs some nasty business down here, starving and torturing his hostages, forcing them to write to their families and beg them to do as Jack asks, or he'll slaughter them. And the disconnect between this and the actual Jack the Ripper is starting to break down the immersion significantly by this point. Assassin's Creed has always played loose with history, with events transpiring not quite how they might be known to us if we picked up a history book of some variety, but typically mind is paid to ensure that the broad strokes are at least on the same page. And as a result, even though there are differences, you can see how history would remember that character the way they're remembered in reality. Here I very much so don't feel that same thing. Perhaps it's by design that we don't get the same warm, fuzzy feeling that Assassin's Creed 1 or 2 did, for instance, where we read between the lines of history, and I suppose there's at least some creative liberty in the fact that Jack the Ripper was never formally identified, so for all we know he might have been so nonsensical that he commandeered a bunch of abandoned ships moored just outside of London to keep a metric fuck ton of prisoners, and he may very well have had a huge gang. But I've got to say I have a harder time believing this than some of the Isu stuff. Nonetheless, for gameplay purposes and in the context of the story being told, regardless of its historical authenticity or otherwise, this is a good segment. We skulk around his ships and kill some of his boys, and it progresses into the Blackbox mission from this investigation. One thing I really appreciate about Syndicate that carries over into the DLC is how it strives to ensure that these Blackbox missions truly stand out, and while standing out in Assassin's Creed is fairly straightforward against a backdrop of missions that largely aren't particularly inventive nor awfully inspired, these are nevertheless the moments you want to have a bit more to them, and they do. In this Blackbox mission we find ourselves taking on yet another of Jack the Lad's lieutenants, the sadistic warden of his makeshift prison, a bloke named Chief Warder Billingsworth, who appears to have a peculiar execution fetish, one he's more than happy to indulge. And just like the Lady Oa's assassination, this is another fun Blackbox mission that stands as a testament to what that system can be, even if what it objectively is feels incredibly rudimentary. However, more so than the Lady O mission, I noticed here that Blackbox missions can be obstructive to layering the assassination missions, and that's partially down to their non-linear element, but it's more obvious here because this mission does layer itself somewhat. You have the investigation aboard the ships before you actually commit to tracking down the Chief Warder and taking his life, and that just makes it obvious that while Blackbox missions are incredibly fun, they're not tailored towards any form of linear storytelling, which ultimately Assassin's Creed to a point does possess, or at least did possess. It's this open-ended nature that isolates the storytelling to the start and end point of the mission rather than having it flow through it, and ultimately storytelling can be the greatest motivation for doing things the long way, as it's something of a currency. You get more value if you do things in a particular fashion. And the Blackbox missions, if anything, put emphasis on the rather straightforward gameplay rewards for doing things a certain way, but considering how easy these Assassin's Creed games typically are, there's nothing to make you care about that as such. You care because it makes the mission better, and I agree, it does. And maybe the illusion of the reward is enough, and it certainly is for the sake of the fun gameplay you get out of it, but this Blackbox system is one of those systems Assassin's Creed had boundless potential in, and it would have been nice to see it explored with more narrative consequences. Take for instance, you do one thing, that means perhaps certain avenues aren't available to you anymore, but more opportunities crop up. Perhaps the unique kill opportunity changes depending on the position that you force your target into based on your other actions. Perhaps there are cutscenes in the mix outside the start and end point, to which there are variations depending on what it is you actually did, and the gameplay consequences occur in tandem with narrative beats, all of which are dynamically influenced by your approach. There is so much potential in Assassin's Creed Syndicate and Unity's Blackbox mission setup, and I know they toyed around with it somewhat in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and I'm led to believe they certainly did with Mirage, and they're certainly going to with Shadows, but I've got to say it's probably obvious I've lagged behind with Assassin's Creed since Valhalla, so irrespective of what they've done with it since, all I can say is the concept of Blackbox missions is one of the better ideas to come out of the entire franchise since its inception. Oh Christ, almost 18 years ago. That makes me feel old. If we're talking inception, it would be longer actually, wouldn't it? Oh god, what am I doing with my life? Anyway, in their current existence, or at least their existence circa 2015, Assassin's Creed Blackbox missions were great if you played them exactly the way the game thought you would, but if you go off the rails, there's no real room to experiment. It doesn't really have any of that. And that's probably in hindsight a simpler way to have made my point. Anyway, Eevee kills Billingsworth with a slight taste of his own medicine, followed by a stab to the neck. We get a White Room confession with the guy, who looks like he's been plucked straight from Dishonored, and he gives us a vague rundown of what Jack's actually trying to accomplish, which I believe is a bastardization of the Creed that he perceives to be Jacob Fry's inspiration. But frankly, this would have more weight being vague if that was explored in more detail later. It's really not. But it would seem to boil down to the assassins aren't doing enough sentiment, and that, considering what Jack the Ripper himself has been doing, does leave an awful lot to be desired. After we leave the White Room and the lighting is done skitzing out, Eevee informs the police of her discovery via a telephone that she named, by the way. Let's not forget that. And then swipes the keys and frees Jack's Templar prisoners. I'm sure that won't backfire. I really will never let go of the fact there are just Templars in cages here. I'm sorry, I'm not capable of it. And then, well, we leave. Except we don't, as this is the point where, for the first time since the intro, we play as Jack the Ripper himself. I do appreciate that he's been rather absent for the bulk of this expansion up until this point, as that ultimately made it more suspenseful, but now we're inhabiting the character as he arrives at this prison to tie up loose ends. and what that usually entails is killing police officers. Now, playing as Jack the Ripper, I've already gone over why I'm not necessarily fond of it as an idea, and in practice it appears he just likes to go killing indiscriminately. Of course, he doesn't kill civilians apparently, and being an assassin for the most part, aside from the fear mechanics, plays the exact same as Eevee, or should I say Jacob from the main game, who played the exact same as Eevee. I'm not sure why I'm convoluting this point, and the only real differences are visual cues. There's a much more potent and noticeable vignette that draws your attention towards the centre of the screen, or towards the edges because the vignette is noticeable, and the HUD also often distorts the screen with random pulses and words cropping up, basically giving us our objectives from the perspective of a frantic mind. I guess what Ubisoft is trying to go for is the fact that Jack is utterly insane, except I'm not entirely sure how, in his insanity, if it is this invasive to his regular functions, he's able to pull off such a grand, encompassing, terrible scheme. But hey, the point comes across with objectives being delivered in a way that's unique, and that's nice. However, the gameplay with Jack doesn't have him do a right lot that's all that interesting. It's mostly just running around killing people, and engaging with the occasional thing beyond that. But mostly it's about just brutalising police officers by the looks of things. Also, for reasons that can't be explained, Jack's voice does make me chuckle.
There's my favourite hangman. The warder had orders to burn all their personal effects. The police must not find this evidence. No one must find my guest's personal effects. It won't be long before my masterpiece will bring her running right into my arms. I look forward to the family reunion.
It's a deep, intimidating, slightly muffled Cockney voice that both suits a brutal, murderous maniac and a Millwall fan, which is basically the same thing. Another thing I'm not too fond of with the Jack the Ripper gameplay is it does have a lot of killing in it. In the confines of an Assassin's Creed game, I'm not against that, but the entire point of him as an antagonist is he's killing with purpose. And while purpose isn't entirely void here, the gameplay segments where he goes slaughtering indiscriminately kind of eclipse the key run of victims that the historical Jack the Ripper is infamous for. I'm having a hard time believing that in this story, Jack the Ripper would be known for the murders that he was known for in real life, when there are segments where he's utterly decimating hordes of police officers and his own gang members. Furthermore, it cheapens those actual murders. It makes them look less significant than the massacres he can conduct, and the only reason we know they're significant is because they were real things that happened, and this just frankly is not. Sure, it's interesting to see an assassin's skills furiously unleashed, but we shouldn't be having to rely on actual knowledge of history in order to understand what parts of the plot are significant, and what parts are less so, as the Ripper is delivered in an uncontrolled fashion because the game wants us to play as him and go off the rails. Having small segments where you do play as the antagonist is an interesting idea to toy around with, but aside from rendering this expansion a justifiable length, I actually don't know what it adds here. If anything, I get a feeling it dilutes the character that Ubisoft is trying to portray, as going around massacring people doesn't expand on his warped ideology. Had the game focused on that, what sets him apart, why he's fundamentally insane, and has us in more detail at least visit the events that rendered him this way, I think it would have been overall much more interesting. Better yet, it would have felt more purposeful. I personally think there should have been less segments of us playing as Jack the Ripper, unleashing his fury on people who don't deserve to die, and some who do because the game wants us to inhabit a power fantasy of some warped variety, and instead of just prioritised flashbacks where Jack was just a kid named Jack, perhaps even do it from the perspective of Jacob and go over some key events that led us to the Whitechapel murders. That would certainly have been more interesting, though I do understand the game doesn't necessarily want us to sympathise with Jack, but if that's the moral concern, why make the DLC at all? After all, you're already using Jack the Ripper's cursed moniker to sell a product, and that perspective would have been more enriching versus simply playing as the villain in a hopeless bid to make him seem dissimilar to Eevee, only for him to actually function incredibly similarly aside from the paranoid schizophrenia. And the thing is, the game at least bids to address that anyway. The game doesn't shy away from giving Jack a tragic backstory. After, of course, Eevee discovers the horrific scene of the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, a moment that, if nothing else does, solidifies that Jack the Ripper is a monster, and hardens Eevee's resolve to see him put in the ground. This spurs her on to investigate the previous murder sites of Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes and Elizabeth Stride, at all of which Jack has left some clues that vaguely explain what he's doing. basically luring Eevee to him the long way. And this investigation leads Eevee to the site of Jack's mother's murder, where we learn that Jack's mum was killed by Crawford Starrick at some point during 1868, but of course in the base game we never see that, and that would have at least instilled some carryover quality. Had we seen this in the main game of Syndicate, it would have not only given us the opportunity for a character to die, which is a very impactful moment, it also could have been delivered in a way that at that point we were none the wiser. Anyway, we learned that Jack spent some time in Lambeth Asylum, shortly following his mother's death, where he was effectively tormented, and that suggests an early setting for his mental illness, at which point, why the bloody hell did Jacob train him in the first fucking place? Oh yeah, you're a bit mad. Would you like to learn how to kill people? As unhinged as it is, I won't even pretend it's not on brand for Jacob, but I have a very hard time believing the assassin he becomes would tutor somebody so unstable. Sure, there might be more storytelling depth that we're simply not privy to, in which there were more factors to consider, but that's not a part of the story. These details are not divulged, therefore they don't exist. So rather than getting context for how this descent into madness ran simultaneously with Jack training as an assassin, we're left wondering what on earth was Jacob thinking, before quickly getting a taste of Eevee's fear gas, in which she hallucinates and fights various versions of the Ripper. Except it turns out that Eevee's just been beating the daylights out of random men. Okay then. Anyway, this reasonably lures Eevee to the madhouse where the finale occurs. First we get a gameplay segment of Jack killing people again, and of course erasing all traces of his existence, and then Eevee arrives and we resume control of her. She finds her way to the Asylum's basement, and it's down here where we find many cells, in one of which she appears to find a broken Jacob Fry. But before we can rescue him, Jack makes his presence known, and Eevee will need to deal with him before she can rescue her brother. I like the atmosphere in this room. It's incredibly ominous, and Jack doesn't immediately show up, instead quickly appearing, lunging from above, which puts us at an immediate disadvantage. In open combat, we can't hurt Jack, with direct attacks dealing no damage as he simply blocks them. So instead we've got to run off, break the line of sight, and then stealth attack him. Using eagle vision, we can see him searching, we can see where he's moving and all of that, and genuinely, it has to be said, I love this feeling of irrational dread I get for pixels when I'm forced to run away after dealing damage. I love how Jack taunts us as we simply try to evade his gaze and get close enough to attack. However, we only have to do this twice, which is arguably quite underwhelming. I see elements of inspiration from perhaps the Mr. Freeze fight from Batman Arkham City here, and they could easily have elaborated this chamber more and gone for something quite similar, but ultimately, by comparison, this is incredibly flat. But the final boss fight certainly taps into the atmosphere of the DLC overall, and plays into the idea that both these characters are hunting each other, something we've gone over as perhaps one of this DLC's stronger narrative elements. I do think there are ways in which they could have made this harder. For instance, having us sneak up on Jack more than twice. It also would have been interesting to see Jack adapt to attacks we've used against him, meaning we have to approach him from different directions, which is why making this chamber more elaborate would have certainly made for something more fun. Take for instance unique kill opportunities that do damage. That would have been an idea the Blackbox missions basically delivered on a platter that isn't utilised here. It would have also been nice to see Jack get more proactive in his pursuit of us the more times we successfully get him. It would have meant less need for random Asylum inmates to show up and attack after we've successfully got him twice, keeping the confrontation that bit more intimate, if you understand what I mean. Nonetheless, this portion of the fight is just a fight. It's incredibly easy, and amidst this we finally get the chance to kill Jack.
I am not a monster! You will not make a monster of me!
Ubisoft must have really thought they cooked with that line as Eevee brutalises Jack in a way that drags on far longer than even Jack's fear takedowns. Funnier still is something of a bug that never gets patched after you're done, proving that you are indeed a monster.
You will not make a monster of me!
Eevee for some reason repeats the back end of that line, and with that Jack the Ripper has finally fallen to Eevee Fry's blade. Even in his White Room confession, his face is never revealed. True to the approach they went for, I suppose. Jacob Fry is finally safe, and Frederick Aberline helps Eevee cover up the Assassin's Creed truth behind what Jack truly was. It's a halfway decent ending, if not a bit dissatisfying. The plot overall has its merits, playing with a tone that is genuinely fascinating, but its overall issue is, the more you pry into it, the more unhinged it seems, and that is both intentional and unintentional, as the more you search for details on the events, the less they actually make sense, but at least Jack is not portrayed as redeemable. He's portrayed as insane, perhaps even evil come the end, and the DLC does repeatedly touch down on that even if it's not satisfyingly explored. But considering the actual historical context to this story, I can appreciate the DLC doesn't do anything egregiously insensitive, at least not in a cut and dry sense, and with that it's over. But this video isn't, as we've still got to touch down upon the side content. It has to be said, side content is hardly a Ubisoft game specialty. We've already gone over shutting down the fight clubs because Jack has commandeered the Rooks and turned them into a murder gang. Kidnap missions also make a return. Just kill them, it's quicker. Freddy really doesn't mind, which is frankly odd considering he's got something of an ill-explored subplot in which his frustrations with Eevee Fry make it beyond apparent he has ethical concerns about working with the Assassin Brotherhood at all. There are missions in which we investigate falsified Ripper letters, of which there were a lot during the Whitechapel murders, so it does get some points for taking into account the events. And these are basically tailing missions after which we need to terrify the guy who's been writing the fake letters, although do be warned it's incredibly easy to accidentally kill the guy you want to scare, which will reset the mission, showing that Syndicate is indeed capable of side content in which doing the wrong thing doesn't just bypass the actual intended content. There's also something called slow carriage escapes, and if that doesn't sound fun, it's because it's not. And basically, we've got to drive as slowly as possible as to avoid detection as we transport a Jack the Ripper suspect to a police station for questioning, I think. If you drive too quickly, you'll be detected and will have to evade some angry locals who would of course have been skittish at the time, but it doesn't make a huge difference to the outcome. These just aren't fun. It's also a missed opportunity to enrich this world space with the contemporary suspects, as their dialogue is incredibly generic. Away from that, we can of course pay some mind to aiding the prostitutes in the area. Take for instance liberating brothels from the Rook's control. This is basically a rehash of the child liberation side missions from the base game, except those we need to liberate this time are adults, so they can in fact die, except nothing I did seemed to ever encourage that. Once we've freed the prostitutes, we then have to go and kill the leader, who for some reason, under no circumstances can we just assassinate. It has to be in an open brawl. There are lost women objectives in which we have to rescue a woman from being abducted, except the moment you accept this mission, the activity immediately resets before you can actually do it. Yeah, this doesn't work. But when it does, basically we hijack the carriage and rescue the woman. There are missions where we have to assassinate more of Jack's lieutenants, of which there appear to be several in a confined space. Yeah, this is alright content. It scratches the checklisty itch. I have no idea why he's employing generic Templars, but maybe Jack's playing both sides, I guess. These side missions don't really have much to them, but they suit their purpose. And then there are walks of shame in which you basically kidnap men who are exploiting the prostitutes in London and optionally shame them as you take them to Nelly, at which point it just becomes something of a coerced walk, doesn't it? Beyond that, I've got to admit I didn't see the point in the cargo hijacks, so I just didn't do them. And of course there are collectibles such as chests and animus fragments. All things considered, it's nothing special Assassin's Creed side content. There isn't a lot to rave about, and there isn't a lot to critique in depth that I haven't already. It's quite uninspired and dull, and to be fair, there is a merit in the satisfaction of having completed it, but that just goes for the psychological aspect of content in a game, I suppose. So overall, this DLC's not really a bad one. At times it can be a bit maddening and unhinged, but overall it does have some positives. The revised darker tone is a welcome change of pace from the base game of Syndicate. It feels more fitting for Assassin's Creed. I like the conservative nature of the soundtrack here as well, considering the very nature of the content it's dealing with. It's very muted, oftentimes there is no music occurring, but when there is music it's very drony and ambient, and as nonsensical as it was at times, I also appreciated the Eevee-centric narrative. I didn't like that towards the back end of Syndicate, Eevee took a back seat more often than not. It's good that she got her time to shine here, along with more Blackbox missions for her specifically, and I also like the much more serious approach to Frederick Aberline. Here he's a hardened detective with his own opinions on the assassins and how they go about things, and considering the pressure he's under, he shows more spine in addressing the assassins how he sees them, and I actually think if anything he's underutilised. After all, these are the events that he's famed for. But ultimately, the handling of the Ripper is a different tin of worms. I understand what Ubisoft think they were going for with this character, but I'm not sure that I understand what they achieved. They didn't want to make the expansion a mystery of who he was, that much I get and that much I respect. But in order to make way for segments in which we play as him, they demystified him a bit too much, and the end result is a faceless madman whose objective beyond his own insanity is incredibly unclear, and his kill count extends far beyond the canonical victims, so to speak, and the end result is the overall expansion loses focus, and an antagonist that had every advantage to be compelling just kind of exists, does bad things, and needs to die. The end result is something that was rather disjointed, as the conspiracy, as it were, isn't explained, as the game drives an insurmountable wedge between the core facts that make reading between the lines of history in Assassin's Creed so engaging and enthralling, and the utterly unhinged creative liberties on display. That being said, I can really see why this one is remembered fondly. It's so easy to get caught up in the impeccably delivered tone, and of course how you perceive the actual story contents is a matter of some opinion. After all, if you're won over by the idea of Jack the Ripper being an assassin, perhaps it makes more sense to you. For me, it took a bit more convincing. However, exploring the idea isn't something I was closed-minded to. I just don't necessarily think a depraved lunatic needed to be anything more than a depraved lunatic. All things considered though, they could have done one worse and made Jack the Ripper a Templar instead of an assassin, which would have been hilariously bad, as that most certainly would have been a layer this plot doesn't need. But hey, I'm gonna stop rambling. The Jack the Ripper DLC is far from a bad expansion, and the tone is fantastic, it's just overall a bit nuts. Thank you for watching, I'll see you soon.